Oh, actually, sorry. You know what? I'll cut this out later. And then I would pronounce your name as Dr. Emily Stephen. Is that correct?
Steven, yep, like the first
Stephen.
name.
Okay, great. Um, oh, is Stephen your first name? No, Emily, right?
Yeah, Emily, Dr. Emily Steven or Professor Emily Steven or Emily or yeah.
Okay. And from what I found online, you're a professor, an assistant professor at Boston University teaching statistical neuroscience. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Amazing. So that's what we'll start off with. So today, joining Community, we have Dr. Emily Stephen. She's an assistant professor on statistical neuroscience at Boston University. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. Could you please expand on the educational and professional journey that's led you to where you are right now?
Sure. Yeah. So, as you said, right now I'm in a math and statistics department. My training in undergrad was in neuroscience, actually. So I've always been kind of a mathy person. So when I started in undergrad, I started in engineering, and then I explored computer science, and I kind of ended up in a lot of different classes across a broad range of fields, and kind of hit on cognitive science as something that I really liked. And it turned out, so I was at Brown, and they have a computational track within the cognitive neuroscience major. And I was like, oh, that's great. It puts together the, math and computer science, but also neuroscience that I had started to be interested in. And so I just did that and ended up, yeah, kind of getting hooked on computational neuroscience. So that was what I ended up doing for undergrad. I didn't decide right away to go to grad school. I actually spent a couple years doing consulting after undergrad, just to see if I would like jobs outside of academia, because I think we spend so much time in school, we really know what it's like to be a teacher because you see teachers all the time and you see researchers. Like if you're doing research, you see what it's like to be a researcher, but you don't necessarily see what it's like to, work in an office and do kind of more businessy stuff. So I did that for a couple years after undergrad, and then finally decided that no, I really did want to go into academia, and did grad school. So grad school was in computational neuroscience again. And that was at BU actually. So I'm at the same place where I did grad school. And so there was a computational neuroscience degree there that I got my PhD in. And then in biological sciences in general, it's very common to do postdocs after grad school. So I did two postdocs, one at MIT for 4 to 5 years, and one at UCSF for 2 years. So this is a long journey. That's an important thing to say. And then, yeah, that's in 2001 was when I got the job at BU and started at BU. So I've been in math and statistics at BU since 2001. Um, and yeah, so actually, I mean, starting in undergrad, it was pretty direct. I think a lot of people have very winding roads, and I guess it didn't feel direct at the time, but when I tell it as a story, it sounds like it is.
Right. So just to summarize, you knew that you enjoyed math, and so at BU, you explored a few different fields, but you landed on computational neuroscience. And since then, you've been working within sort of the same field, and now you're an assistant professor at BU in that topic. Okay, thank you so much. Could you expand more about what you're doing at your current position, what it means to be like an assistant professor and doing the research that you are doing right now?
Sure, yeah. So I'm an assistant professor. I'm tenure track, which means that when I started, I was given oh shoot, I'm supposed to know this number. I think it's 6 years um, of kind of a job, right? A guaranteed job. They almost guaranteed for 6 years. And then at the end, they're going to do a tenure review and decide whether to give me tenure. Um, so uh, So there are tenure track jobs and not tenure track jobs. Mine happens to be tenure track. And BU is an R1 research university, which means that as like the research side of the university is almost as important as the teaching side of the university. And so in fact, BU does hire people who don't even do any teaching at all, right? So for me, my job is about half and half. So I teach 3 courses per year, and and then the rest of the time is spent doing research. Doing research for me means supervising graduate students and undergraduate students on research projects, and then publishing papers, getting grants, things like that. The courses that I teach are currently I have like 2 courses that that I do potentially multiple times a year. So the first one is introductory statistics for STEM majors. So that's a pretty big class. There are over 100 students in it, and I'm teaching, statistics. There's a lot of overlap between that class and an AP statistics class. And then the other class that I teach is for graduate students, for PhD students, and it's called Time Series Analysis for Neuroscience Research. And so it's very specialized statistics and data science, specifically as applied to neuroscience and specifically as applied to time series recordings, which are basically any kind of data that you get that has a time axis, right? That's a time series. So there's specialized ways of doing statistics on that kind of data, and that's the topic of the course.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I know you mentioned that you started undergrad knowing that you enjoyed mathematics and you found your foothold in neuroscience. Do you remember like a specific moment before then when you knew that you wanted to pursue a career in STEM? And was there anyone who maybe inspired you to go down that route?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, both of my parents are were STEM majors in undergrad. My mom was a science teacher, and she was very involved in the Massachusetts Science and Engineering Fair, MSCF, or I think that maybe they call it MSSEF. I forget now.
Yeah, yeah.
MSCF, right. So I participated in that in high school, and it was also required at my school, and just loved it. It was a great experience. I love just geeking out with people about my science projects. So that was definitely kind of when I realized that I liked kind of science. And then my dad's actually a scientist at or was at the university. No, sorry, what's it called? The Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. So he's actually a physicist. And so I think probably my parents were what made me think that STEM was a reasonable career path. But I was pretty resistant to the idea of doing what they did. So I remember in high school, I told them, there's no way I'm going to be a scientist. There's no way I'm going to, I'm going to stop taking math as soon as I get to undergrad and like going to do something totally different. And so it was actually I think that was just stubbornness because it turned out when I started taking the classes, I really loved it. And I kind of wanted to do it despite my parents. So yeah, so they were kind of both the inspiration and maybe a reason why I didn't come to it sooner.
That's really funny because you did mention at the beginning that you loved mathematics when you entered undergrad. Yeah, thank you. That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, could you share more about like what you enjoy about your profession and then what are some of the hardest parts related to your work?
Sure, yeah. So let's see. I think kind of from a big picture, what I enjoy most is just kind of the detective work
Mm.
of kind of trying to find mysteries in data and figure out what's causing them. And I think I just have that kind of instinct of like not wanting to let go of something strange. If it's strange, I need to figure out why. Um, and I think that just kind of is what causes me to latch on to scientific problems and kind of keep going until we have some kind of an explanation. And I love that. And I love the process of working through it with other people. So especially now being able to mentor graduate students and they're, it's like a back and forth process where we're just like, you know, chatting and talking and like puzzling things out together. That kind of social element of it is really, really satisfying to me. Um, yeah. So I think I forget the rest of the question. I was gonna say more.
No, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. That was lovely. The second part of the question was, what are some of the hardest parts related to your work?
Oh, the hardest parts. Okay, so the very number one hardest part, and this was a major reason why I didn't want to go into science early on. Um, the number one hardest part is you never quite know exactly what you're expected to do. And you never quite know exactly if what you're working on is gonna get you anywhere. It's very like there's very little feedback,
Mm.
right? If you're in a class and you do a homework assignment, someone's going to tell you at the end if it's right or wrong. Even if it's like an essay or something, someone's going to tell you what could be improved. Someone's going to tell you. And I think a lot of jobs, not all jobs, but there are jobs out there that have that same structure where it's like, we're paying you to do this as long as you accomplish these tasks, you'll be paid and maybe you'll get a promotion or whatever. And I think science isn't really set up that way. So, and like there are little things that if you're being funded, if you get the job, um, if your papers are being cited, for example. But any given project is kind of venturing into the unknown, and it forces you to be very um tolerant
Mm.
of not knowing if you're even taking the right approach or and that takes a very long time to get used to. I think I'm starting to get used to it now, but it's been what 15 years or something that I've been doing this, and most of that time I was not at all comfortable with the uncertainty.
Mm. When
It's
was
also one more thing. It's also a very difficult career in terms of um, career trajectories because you do have to move a lot. So you typically will move to a different city for graduate school, then you'll move to a different city for postdocs. And I did that twice, and then I moved again for faculty. So it takes a very long time before, at least for me, before I was in a position where I'm like, oh, I could actually be in this city for more than 5 years. And it's difficult to kind of navigate that with everything else that's going on in my life.
Yeah, no, that's definitely hard. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I guess talking about the second point that you brought up, or maybe it was your first, about like meeting that uncertainty as a scientist. When was like the first time that you maybe encountered that, and how did you get over it? And if there were like certain qualities as a scientist that you think would help our future aspiring scientists in facing that uncertainty.
Yeah, good question. So I mean, the first time I thought of it as an issue, I think you can't do a science project without encountering that, unless you're like doing a science project out of a book where it's just like do these things but like if you're designing your own science project, you're going to be facing that. I think the first time I thought of it as an issue was in the research that I did in undergrad, and I worked in a neuroscience lab where we were studying vision. And we wanted to understand how the brain, how the signals in the brain change when your eyes are moving. So your eyes move very quickly. And so they go from fixation to fixation in jumps, and the jumps are called saccades. And we wanted to understand like does the representation in the brain reset every time there's a saccade, or does it kind of continue? Like, is there still information after the saccade about where your eyes were before? And, questions like that. And while I can explain that question in plain English fairly quickly, actually pinning that down into like, how should we analyze this data and how should we interpret it in order to claim that we're answering the question that we started out with, actually I kind of was a really difficult challenge for me. And so I worked on that project for about a year and a half, and we had pretty clear results in terms of we were able to quantify how neural signals were changing around the time of a saccade. So like relative to what it was doing before, what does it do after? But even just being able to interpret that in terms of like, oh, was there a reset, or was it a continuous change? Like the answers, I was left kind of feeling like um, the connection between the data analysis and the plain language questions
Mm.
was difficult to make. Like that link was difficult. And I think I realized that, so now when I'm reading scientific research, that happens a lot, right? Where people will say, we have this question and we answered it this way. And depending on my own personality and my own knowledge and intuitions, I might find their analysis sufficient, or I might find it totally beside the point, right? And I think that's a part of this just like uncertainty of like, I'm thinking that this is a logical way to approach this problem, and I can try to be persuasive when I write why my actual report on why I think that this is the answer to the problem. But there's always going to be people who see holes in it that I didn't see, and that's part of that uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah. So you've been working in computational neuroscience for a while. What are some of the most exciting, scientific advances in your field?
Wow. Yeah. What are some of the
Yeah.
most, okay. Well,
And
so one of the biggest ones, when I first started, brain-computer interfaces were only just starting to be a thing. So brain-computer interfaces are any time where you're recording brain activity and you're using it to control any kind of device. So you could be using it to control a robotic arm, you could be using it to control a cursor on a computer screen, or to type. Um, and so within the last, 15 years, brain-computer interface technology has just exploded. It's gotten so much more, it's got so much better. Um, and it's really exciting. So when I was at UCSF, I worked in a lab that's building a brain-computer interface for speech. So they work with people who are totally paralyzed. So they've had some kind of injury usually to their spine. That means they can't move. Often they can't even move their face. Um, Sometimes they can move their eyes, but that's kind of about it. And they so this lab will actually implant electrodes in the part of the brain called the motor cortex. So this is the part of the brain that controls movement, and they can use it to synthesize speech.
wow.
So you could actually control, so people who can't otherwise speak are able to speak with this. Now it's totally invasive. It requires surgery to implant the electrode. So it's not going to be used anytime soon for like, Facebook or Apple or whatever. But so that kind of research has it's been so exciting to see how it's been going over the last 15 years. Um, when I first started, like in undergrad, I thought that I would study brain-computer interfaces, and so that was one of the things that got me the most excited about the field. But now I actually do a lot more work with kind of basic science, just understanding how the brain works in different ways. And I think the biggest oh, it's going to be hard to explain this. But like, I think the most exciting advance, at least in like in computational neuroscience, is um, what's called population coding. So this is an idea that's been around for a very long time that that you don't want to be looking just at one neuron at a time. So the neurons are the cells that are carrying the information in the brain. So the idea is like if you're looking at a brain area, you want to look at maybe the average activity across a whole set of neurons, and that will be a more consistent or stable representation of the information that's encoded in that part of the brain than if you just look at individual neurons. So that idea has been around for a very long time, but within the last, let's say, 10 years, it's been like new machine learning methods have been kind of brought to bear on that problem of like what a population code is. So how information is represented across lots of neurons instead of individual neurons. And instead of just thinking about like the average activity in a single neuron, we now have ways of summarizing what's called a latent state. So this is like, you could imagine like an abstract three-dimensional space. And so like three axes, you've got your space, and neural state is a point in that space. And so one point in that space represents all of the neurons that you're recording from. And it moves around in time. And so these latent dynamics will sometimes form circles, they'll sometimes form spirals, they'll sometimes they'll follow surfaces in three-dimensional space that have more structure to them than you would see if you were looking at the either just one-dimensional mean of the electrodes or the maybe thousand-dimensional space of every single one of your thousand neurons. So I realize this is getting a little bit technical, but this kind of latent state interpretation and using machine learning and kind of high dimensional geometry to represent neural activity has actually opened up a whole new world of questions that we didn't have the tools, like the mathematical tools to study before. And so that also has been maybe just as interesting to me as the brain-computer interface work.
Is that related to the work that you're doing currently as well?
Um, Yes-ish.
I guess.
So one of the things that at UCSF, the work that I did was studying how the brain responds to speech, auditory speech. So if I'm listening to you, there's a part of my brain called the superior temporal gyrus, kind of around here, that processes sounds related to speech.
Mhm.
And I did some work, some latent state analysis of sounds related to speech. And I found that so if you start talking to me and you say a sentence, in latent space, the population vector, so the population representation does a
Okay.
spiral,
Mhm.
and the spiral is every time there's so every time there's like a word or a chunk of information, it'll do a circle in the spiral. And so there's kind of this long time scale representation, which is, so if the spiral is going this way, this axis will tell you how far into the sentence you are, and the circles will tell you how far into the word you are.
Oh wow. Okay.
And so we made the case, we argued, I don't know, some people will find this a good argument, some people won't, but we argued that this kind of latent state representation could be used by the brain to actually to organize words and to parse out different words and connect different features to the word that they occur in, right? So there are certain features like in the word day, there's the sound d and ae and e, and all of those correspond to the same word. So if we have this representation in the brain that's telling us, well, all of this part relates to day, then you can kind of put the different features onto that word as a scaffolding.
Wow, that's really
Um,
exciting. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. Moving on to sort of the next section of our interview, which is more about representation of women in STEM. Just being a woman in STEM, I think you could definitely give some insight on what sort of the demographics of women pursuing mathematics and then computational neuroscience look like throughout the years in your undergrad, your postdoc, and PhD, and where you are right now.
mhm. Yeah, so let's see. So biological fields tend to have fairly good representation of women, and so neuroscience is not an exception. There are lots of women in neuroscience. And in computational neuroscience, there are also lots of women, but fewer, right? So it's not 50%, but I would say, like pure math has the least women, neuroscience is doing pretty good, and computational neuroscience is somewhere in between. And so most of my career is, and as you probably know, the representation gets worse and worse the further in your career you go. So let's see. So right now I'm more on the math side of things than I ever was before because I'm in a math and statistics department. And there are oh shoot, I should know the numbers for this. Within statistics, I shouldn't say numbers because I'm going to be wrong, but there are substantially fewer female faculty than there are men in my department. Um, but it's not e extreme. I think our department is doing fairly well relative to other similar departments. But relative to other fields, we're not doing great. Right? Just because I think math and statistics in general are lower.
Mhm. Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. I guess moving more broadly, what are your thoughts on representation of women in STEAM and the way diversity and inclusion impacts the STEAM innovation and progression?
I think it's critical to get more women involved and get more women's voices. Um, I think when like the women that I see at every stage are contributing just in amazing ways that are often kind of different than the men that are, right? I think women, like we all are individuals and we all think differently, and the more we can get more diverse perspectives, the more every aspect of academia and everywhere benefits. Um, I mean, I think it's really tough because there are practical reasons why pursuing a career in academia is really hard for
Mhm.
anyone. And so it's really hard for me to say you should do this or anyone should do this when there are real compromises to be made. And what I mean by that is exactly what I was talking about before, about how it requires, moving every 4 to 5 years for the first, 15 years of your career often. Um, and it's often quite time consuming, and not everyone gets a faculty job. So you can go through, you can do grad school, you can do postdoc and still not get the faculty job, which isn't necessarily a failure because a lot of people in the process realize that there are other jobs that they're just as passionate about that can use the skills that they're training in grad school and in postdocs and in undergrad, of course. And so, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do grad school because you might not get a faculty job because there are lots of jobs that require that training that aren't faculty. Um, but it is like, if that is the thing you want, it's a very risky thing to go for. It's not as bad as being a professional athlete, but I kind of think about it that way. It's right. It's like you can be really, really good and still not get the job. Which is terrifying. And that's another thing that it takes getting used to or I over the years started to get used to, was just the, again, uncertainty about my own future. Um, and that, yeah, I don't want to be a downer, but it is a big deal.
Thanks for that insight. And then I guess you stemming off of that, or just sharing any other experiences, if you'd like, could you describe any challenges that you faced as a woman in STEM and the ways that you've overcome it?
I mean, I think it's hard because nothing that I've faced has really felt like a challenge as a woman in STEM. I feel like all of the challenges that I faced have been challenges that could happen to anyone who's pursuing this. Um, so like I haven't really faced a lot of discrimination for being a woman. I think, anywhere you go, there are going to be kind of arrogant people that you have to deal with, but I think everyone deals with arrogant people. Um, and I think I've had a lot of privilege. Just, I came from a family where my dad had a PhD, so I kind of knew what to do. I have a lot of benefits of like I had, that not everyone has. Um, but I mean, I think the major thing for me has been um the moving, has been having to move. And twice now I've moved without my partner, which is a very difficult decision to make. And I think that is that is one of the major reasons why a lot of women will not move on to the next stage, is because they just don't want to move without their partner. And I've done it twice. Doesn't mean I recommend it. I mean, it's worked out for me. I'm doing great. My partner's moving to Boston. We're going to be happy. But being able to do that is a privilege. So yeah.
Just to summarize, you personally haven't faced that discrimination, but definitely being in academia, there are a lot of personal compromises that come with it, that can be very challenging for everyone.
I think that's my opinion on it. And other people, I'm only speaking for myself.
Right,
Only.
of course. And then, sort of wrapping this up and talking about this initiative in storytelling, especially, how do you believe that like sharing personal experiences can benefit and inspire future generations?
I think personal experiences are the only way that we really can see how many different options there are, and how, no one's story is perfectly clean and, like the way you think it's going to be when you're going into it. I think um, careers are complicated, and a lot of us, we're making decisions. There are a lot of different factors that go into every decision, and just seeing that people who in all different places have gotten to where they are while making all of these complicated decisions, I think is really helpful. Um, yeah. And I think my advice for that would be to, as much as you can, pursue the thing that you find the most interesting and energizing in the moment, and trust that over time it will converge to a career path that's appropriate for you.
Thanks. Thank you for that. And I think that brings me right to my next question, which is what is some advice that you would give your younger self, and any other future aspiring scientists watching this video?
So the best advice that I got, which I'm really grateful that I got, was to try lots of different things. Um, and especially when you're at the stage where you're deciding what you're going to do after undergrad, I think my advice is don't go straight to grad school. My advice is try another career path first, and only do grad school if you're 100% sure that you know what you're going to use it for. and you know you're going into it with open eyes. Because I think even now I see a lot of people who grad school is kind of the default
Mm.
option, and I think that's grad school is really hard, and there are a lot of other things that you can do that will be just as just as exciting.
Ah, so that concludes our interview. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Stephen. It was a pleasure and it was an honor talking to you today.
It was a pleasure talking to you too. And yeah, if you have any more questions, please feel free to reach out.
Of course. Thank you.